anyone that knows anything about strength and conditioning for sport knows that the load management that happens outside of the sport itself is almost meaningless compared to what's going on in the sport, right? Like you can do your best for an athlete in the off season or in between games, and in season, a lot of it is just facilitating recovery, right? It's understanding the repetitive stress that is the sport and then facilitating any way to reduce that or allow them to continue to strain their body in that way on a continual basis until they get a break from that, so that then you can actually have some time to rebuild. So anyone who's actually ever played a sport or worked with athletes through a season into an off season knows, like, you're in the worst shape at the end of the season. So like it's a miracle that more things like this aren't happening. But in the NBA finals, we're talking like outlier athletes. So it's really irrelevant to have even a conversation around load management in as it pertains to this instance, because there's no possible way that anything you would do in the gym, besides like telling someone to go to sleep and maybe don't go out and get drunk in between games, like, is going to have an impact on their ability to not have an injury in the game. A lot of these athletes, a lot of these strength coaches and teams and staff are doing as much right as they feasibly could be. And anything that they were to do different would make such a small difference in the outcome of, maybe that situation or these games in general, or the health of the players, that it's ridiculous to think that there would be a way to prevent something like this from happening, because it is a freak accident. And pretty much the majority of injuries that happen in sports, I think, could be classified as a freak accident. Like, I'm sure there's very few instances where you can look back into, training in the weight room or training in the off season, and you can draw a straight line back to this caused this injury, right? So to me, it's really hard to even have a conversation around this would have made it better, or this is what caused that, or X, Y, and Z, because it's so many things, so many inputs happening in such a short amount of time that, to me, it's miraculous that shit like this doesn't happen more often than it is when it actually does happen.
And here's the thing, and like, I have this on good authority. Like, I have friends we have friends in a lot of leagues, and I know firsthand the conversations like this in the playoffs are had preemptively. Like, I'm well aware of a very, very prominent basketball player who got injured, and I know the camp well, I know the people well. And when you take a look at the minutes they log, the travel, I know for a verifiable fact, I'm not going to say who, that someone got injured in the NBA playoffs this year, and it was a risk that they were willing to take because they rode it close to the sun. Now, the injury wasn't severe, but it was something where you go, hey, look, when you look at, and because I was just looking up, sorry if you kind of caught me darting my eyes. In game one, Haliburton played 39 minutes. It's like, yeah, Tyrese Haliburton was on the court for 39 minutes in game one. And then he has a calf strain in game 5 or 6. It's like, yeah, you played 39 minutes in the fourth round of the playoffs, right? How fucking big is this guy? Right? Because it's like, I don't even know. Like, if Haliburton height, I don't know, how tall do you think this dude is?
6'4".
Where are we at? But it's like, then when we start 6'5", yeah. So we start getting into like lever length and things like that. He's only 185 pounds, Jesus. Right? Like, right? 185. Let me think of what grade. I think 9/11 happened, and I was 185 pounds. Like, that was the last time I was 185 pounds. It was the 6th grade. So it's like, I think, and we'll start to spiral out from these really, these really unique use cases, because you kind of put it like, look, these are the 1% of the 1%. Physical, but their ability, but also in their output, right? Like, this guy is, and here's the thing that people don't understand. We talk at level 3 a lot about acute to chronic workload ratios, which is it's a loose principle that guides load management on either side, because there is an inherent risk in underloading someone, right? Mm-hmm. I was like, Haliburton should have been playing less. It's like, hold on a second. You put Haliburton on the bench for the last 20 games, and then he goes back in clocking 39 minutes. you are now statistically as at higher risk as someone who's been just redlining it all season. So there's a very narrow window of opportunity to get through these sports at this level, at that intensity,
Yeah.
unscathed. And it really comes down to, can you fly that clear air? And then at a certain point, you're dealing almost totally in the realm of luck and chance.
Yeah. And look at it this way. Like, he's in this position because he's in game 7 of the finals, right? Like, it's, if you're going to tear something in game 7 of the finals, I'm pretty sure anyone that was out in any round of the playoffs before that would be willing to put themselves in that position, right? Is you're playing at the highest level of sport that exists. And with that, there's inherent risk that comes with it. You're operating on the outskirts of human capability, and you're doing it at the highest capacity you can. Because if you don't, you're not going to be in that position, and that's the risk that comes with the territory. Period.
Yeah, and I think, maybe kind of bring this into, let's call them normal circumstances. Is there's a saying I really like. It says, "Don't make law from bad cases." And it's like, if you think about that here, like, yeah, he's a bad case. He's a fringe. This is not a precedent setting injury when it comes to, the clients that you work with. Even, and I can tell you this, even at like the collegiate level. The collegiate level is not the same, right? We're probably dealing with half the amount of games. I don't think college basketball is playing more than 40 something games. Like, you double up immediately. So it's like, you don't want to make laws from bad cases. So like, what do you want to start with? You want to start with fundamentals. How does the foot and ankle move, right? There's an injury is two components. There's two components to an injury. There's applied force and tissue tolerance. And one of the things that's consistent with all of the talking heads that start to come out of the woodwork in their very predictable places at very predictable times is they're talking directly about, shout out Coke Zero, unsponsored sponsor of the podcast. The next step is a cigarette. Love Coke Zero. The one thing that they're always banging on about is tissue tolerance. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, hold on a second. That is but half the equation. And it's, if you're thinking that you're going to create a resilient Achilles tendon to the amount of force that someone like Haliburton is capable of putting on day in and day out, putting on day in and day out, you're dealing with the wrong species of animals, right? You need to build some sort of like humanoid AI basketball robot with a fade and a mustache to be able to build something that is going to be as structurally resilient to the applied force that this guy is able to put on that tendon. The question that so rarely ever gets postulated through this type of content is, why are we applying so much force to this tendon to begin with, right? Our body is built in this tensegrity model, which is a mix of words of tension and integrity, and you put those two things together, and it allows us to disperse force efficiently, right? So that's really a better question to ask, right? And asking better questions is the philosophy that informs the science. And people just don't tend to, when you sort of lack experience and wisdom in this field, they don't tend to have the right philosophy. They don't tend to ask the right questions. And so a better question that you may want to ask is, why did we apply so much force to begin with? Because I could tell you that Achilles injury is just as easily a hamstring. It's just as easily an adductor, right? It's just as easy a low back. With a
Mm-hmm.
hooper, absolutely. It's just the luck of the draw of the position he was in that created the weak link in the chain. But anytime you see, right, when you see someone tear an adductor, hamstring, even some of the more obscure muscles into the hip obturator, etc., that's a roll of the dice, random chance, 1 in a billion. But it could, okay, an injury was on its way due to some position that applied too much force to a tendon that didn't have the resiliency, or a muscle that didn't have the resiliency or the tolerance for that force in that position, at that angle, at that exact event in time and space, right? Like, it's very hard. No, I wouldn't even say it's very hard. It's impossible to predict. So it's like, well, okay, what do you do? Can control what you can control. That's it. Control what you can control. And when we dig down to it, it really starts with the principles of like, okay, let's take a look at the foot and ankle. Let's take a look at the tibia, fibula into the knee and the hip. It's like Chris Klatchen is a close friend of mine, an absolute gun of a clinician. He always talks about fixing the system. So you got to fix the system, right? Anytime we see this Achilles thing and the talking heads go on about isometrics and leg press calf raises, you're like, that's not fixing the system. You're discussing the nuances of changing the check engine bulb. You know what I mean? It's just like, so I think when we think biomechanics, it's like, okay, let's start foot and ankle. What are things that you're looking for in a foot and ankle to control what we can? It's like, all right, baseline out of the box human function dictates that we should probably see these attributes of the foot and ankle. Now, in basketball, those might vary. In gen pop people who are new to training, these might vary. But I want to strive towards these attributes. What are we looking for?
Yeah. For me, it starts really simple, and then it gets more complex as we start to look into what makes up these literally two components. What I'm looking for is someone's ability to control their core and pelvic position, and how that relates to their ability to distribute weight through their foot on the floor. So that's literally where it all starts for me. And I just observe, because if there's something I've noticed, especially with athletes, is they're not consciously aware of these things a lot of times. Some of them will be very perceptive, and they might not know that they should be focusing on it, but if you tell them, then they can make a change just like that. Others, like, they're a victim of the repetitive stress of being 6'5", 185 pounds and playing a sport since they were 6 years old. And they more so, as opposed to learning positions, they're kind of forced into positions. So step number one for me is getting an understanding of their awareness around how control of the pelvis relates to foot pressure and control of weight distribution of the foot. Because that to me is kind of the system as a whole. And then as we start to see that there's some sort of issue here or lack of control here, then we start to zoom in at, like, okay, how are the pieces of the system contributing, and where is a lack of function, or where are we compensating for a bias somewhere else? And maybe a little bit deeper than that, then it starts to come down to, all right, how does pelvic control start to relate to hip rotation? And then how does hip rotation start to relate to tibial rotation and its relationship with supination and pronation at the ankle? And that, with all of those components, there's usually some sort of pattern that you could find where, okay, this person has a lack of understanding of how to create a more posterior pelvic tilt. And that is forcing them into maybe an external rotation bias at the hip. So maybe there's more strain through lateral hamstring to stabilize the knee through flexion extension, which creates more of an external rotation bias at the tibia and a supination bias at the foot. So they're always bearing weight on the lateral side of the foot. And something like basketball or something where you have to change direction quickly, maybe that predisposes them to an inversion ankle injury or something of the sort. But without even extrapolating out, at least we can determine at that point, if all those things are present, they at least have a lack of understanding of how to create medial foot pressure, how to create pronation and internal rotation at the hip, internal rotation at the tibia. And as you start to compile these things and you start to find patterns, then really all you have to do is you need to understand, okay, this is the position that they're in. Because they have a bias towards this position, it's like getting an alignment on your cars. Like if my wheels are cranked to the right, so when I'm trying to go straight down the highway, I have to crank that wheel to the left, then this is normal for me, is me cranking the wheel to the left to go straight. Now when I have to turn left, I'm going to really have to crank that thing, and I might not be able to make the left-hand turn that I need to make in the time that I need to make. So if we can get them to have a more neutral alignment in terms of that arc of rotation, whether it's at the hip or the integration of foot mechanics into lower leg mechanics, then we're starting from a more neutral place. So then they have the variability to get in and out of both sides of that arc of rotation, as opposed to just being stuck in one side. And then when they need to go further, then we have to compensate, whether it's through soft tissue structures like the Achilles, like the MCL, like the meniscus or the hip labrum. So that's kind of the general template in my mind, is we need to understand, first off, what are the components of the system? And then deeper than that, how do they integrate, and how do they manipulate positions upstream and downstream from that? And then we just observe what is there too much of, what are we lacking? then it's slowly starting to introduce the pieces that we're lacking into that system so that there's better perception, better awareness around it. And then ultimately we build a greater capacity to be able to control those positions.